Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving right into a highly controversial text from 2008 by a figure known as Deiform Buddha. We are going to clinically unpack the framework of this ideology, strictly to understand exactly how it attempts to construct a rationale for absolute, unchecked power.
Right off the bat, the text resurrects that famous and heavily debated philosophical declaration from Friedrich Nietzsche. But the author actually claims this statement has been widely misunderstood. According to our source material, when Nietzsche said God is dead, he wasn't necessarily denying the existence of a higher power. Instead, the text frames it as a desperate plea for humanity to stop passively waiting around for divine intervention and to start taking massive, aggressive action to solve its own problems.
So you might be wondering, how on earth does a modern ideology twist this core idea of self-reliance to argue for a completely authoritarian, elitist world order? I mean, how do you get from relying on yourself to demanding absolute submission to a superhuman class? Let's map out exactly how the author attempts to build this bridge.
To break this down, we'll look at 5 key areas. 1. Redefining the superhuman. 2. The supposed flaws of humanity. 3. A radical new order. 4. The role of Lifechanyuan. And 5. Action over empty talk.
Let's start with Section 1, Redefining the Superhuman and the Chanyuan Perspective on Nietzsche. According to the source, readers need to adopt what it calls holographic-based thinking. Basically, you have to completely suspend your current beliefs to accept their premise. They argue these superhumans aren't despotic tyrants or fascists, but rather essential, strong-willed creators of a brand new morality. The text describes them as beings who have faced humanity's greatest pain, which supposedly makes them the only ones qualified to govern the mediocre masses.
This really hits the nail on the head regarding the text's view on morality. The author actually claims that traditional values, things like selflessness, equality, and forgiveness, are a trap. The text insists that showing pure kindness toward the ignorant actively degrades society. Because of that, replacing this old morality with a superhuman morality, where a superior class dominates and transcends the weak, is presented not just as an option, but as an absolute necessity for human survival. Moving right along to Section 2, The Flaws of Humanity, which presents a deeply cynical view of the masses. The text relies on a pretty stark psychological analogy here to argue that humans are inherently hypocritical cowards. It sets up this thought experiment. Disguise yourself as a beggar, and even the most pitiful people will look down on you. But disguise yourself as an armed bandit demanding their life, and suddenly even the proudest individuals will drop to their knees and offer up their valuables. The source uses this to conclude that humanity instinctively exploits weakness but absolutely worships sheer strength and dominance.
To hammer home its attack on equality and democracy, the author brings up these highly specific and deeply controversial demographic claims about Zimbabwe. The text claims 80% of the population is unemployed, but then goes drastically further, asserting that 95% of the population are natural-born tricksters and insatiable parasites who just want something for nothing. Even the 50% who identify as Christians, the author claims, are utterly selfish the second they step outside of Sunday church services.
The conclusion the author draws from this is absolutely uncompromising. We're quoting the text verbatim here to show exactly how it thinks. It states that because the masses are supposedly driven entirely by fear and selfishness, democracy and reason are just totally ineffective. The text says, unequivocally, that suffering will persist indefinitely unless democratic systems are completely replaced by superhuman dominance.
That brings us to Section 3, A Radical New Order, where the text attempts to rewrite history and governance.
The author actually claims that history's greatest religious and political icons ultimately failed because, well, they just didn't go far enough. Jesus and Buddha, the text says they relied too much on preaching and compassion instead of wielding pure divine power to force unity. As for Muhammad, Marx, Lenin, and Mao, the author asserts their critical failure was leaving the traditional family unit intact. The text views the family as the ultimate, entrenched bastion of private property and selfishness.
Taking an incredibly extreme stance, the source material explicitly praises white colonial rule. Using anecdotal claims from grassroots Zimbabweans, the author insists that life was actually better under white leadership. The text demands the total abolition of independent nations, outright declaring that self-governance is an active regression of human civilization.
And the historical revisionism doesn't stop there. The text even addresses Adolf Hitler, making the shocking claim that his core philosophy of an elite-run, unified world was sound. It casually dismisses his horrific methods as merely secondary to this grand, overarching vision.
The stark contrast laid out here between the old world we live in and what the author calls the Chanyuan era is wild. In this proposed new order, democracy is entirely replaced by superhuman leadership. The traditional family unit completely abolished to prevent selfishness, and fragmented, independent nations are erased in favor of a single, unified global state managed by an elite class.
All right, Section 4, the role of Lifechanyuan, which is all about building the inner circle. Here's where the author makes a massive pivot. He claims that his own followers, who he calls the Chanyuan Celestials, are literally the exact superhumans he's been talking about this whole time. They're framed not just as a religious group, but as an entirely new, superior human race. Completely unbound by nationality, they are supposedly tasked with the immense destiny of purifying humanity and restoring the earth. But to achieve this grand destiny, the text demands absolute, blind loyalty. The author expresses intense disdain for followers who cower when criticized. In fact, it bizarrely holds up the Italian mafia, along with the authoritarian regimes of Mao Zedong and Joseph Stalin, as the ultimate models of effective discipline and deterrence. The message is crystal clear. If one member is attacked, the collective must strike back without analyzing who is right or wrong, creating a totally untouchable inner circle. Finally, we reach Section 5, Action over Empty Talk, and the group's master plan. The source doesn't just theorize. It lays out a very specific, procedural master plan for its believers. It argues that just shouting about injustice does absolutely nothing. Instead, followers need to integrate into the organization's specific operational structure, test and perfect the ideology in real time, and ultimately culminate their efforts in building what they call a second home, essentially the physical staging ground for this new society. Fascinatingly, the text brings us full circle right back to Nietzsche, but this time to deliver a warning to its followers. The author notes that while they completely adopt Nietzsche's Übermensch philosophy, followers must desperately avoid his fatal flaw. The text claims Nietzsche didn't go mad because his ideas were flawed, but because of the crushing, isolating loneliness of being entirely misunderstood by society. Therefore, the group has to remain strictly unified to avoid this psychological collapse. We are wrapping up our direct analysis of the source material with this intensely aggressive quote from the author. It's a literal do-or-die mentality, explicitly engineered to insulate the ideology from any external critique or opposition.
As we close out this explainer, I want to leave you with a really provocative question to chew on. By stripping away democracy, completely abolishing the family, and demanding unquestioning loyalty under the banner of superhuman superiority, this text engineers a totally flawless echo chamber. So why do these radical, deeply authoritarian architectures of thought continue to attract followers who feel alienated in the modern world? It's absolutely crucial to understand this if we want to grasp the mechanics of extremism today. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive into the source material.